Alright, so today I'm just going to quickly go over the best way to change these parameter settings, work with your prompt to give you some better results if you're using Llama, if you're using GPT-3, you're using ChatGPT, Alpaca, whatever you're using. Obviously, if you're using ChatGPT, you're going to have trouble changing the generation parameters, but you can still edit your prompt to give you results that you probably are interested in. Okay, so here's the prompt that we're going with. It is a puzzle, and I have been testing the puzzle solving and word analogy solving capabilities of the various models. GPT-4 does a pretty good job, but it's had some logical issues, which I will go into later. But this particular puzzle, GPT-3 got wrong initially and was unable to get the correct answer without further correction. And here that is. But we can see that you can tell that Llama, and this is the 30B model, and I've set the temperature to 0. So Llama almost got the answer right, but it also generated a bunch of other questions with humorous answers. So it seems to think that this is a joke more than a puzzle, and that's probably due to the prompt. Okay, so let's start trying to edit these parameters and edit the prompt to give the answer that we want, which is just the solution to this problem. Although the question and answers that it did give are pretty good, this is one of the best prompts without any prompt engineering I've seen in a while from Llama. Actually, I'm pretty impressed with this. But first, let's just define what all these are pretty quickly. I do have that series explaining terms, so there'll be a more in-depth and technical definition. But now I'm just going to give you what these do basically. Okay, so here we are looking at the custom generation parameters. We have options for contrastive search and beam search. So the custom generation parameters, these are the actual parameters that you can change. These affect the probabilities of the next token. Essentially, what becomes a high probability token or what tokens can be considered are affected by changing the custom generation parameters. The contrastive search and beam search, those are decoding strategies that encompass some of the generation parameters as well as using other techniques to select the next token or the next group of tokens. So again, this is just a more practical video, so I'm not going to go into the actual mathematics here. I do have that series where I'm going to be uploading videos with more technical definitions of things. For contrastive search, this is just a decoding strategy that searches for the best output given some parameters, and best is defined with some logs and cosines. It gets extremely ugly. Basically, leave this to 0 and it'll be the greedy search, and the greedy search is just picking the token with the highest probability, not doing any search of the entire tree. And beam search, essentially at each time step, which means each time we're generating a new token, it's going to generate all the possible tokens and then choose the n beams, the top n beams, which is what you set here. So you set this to 7, it's going to choose the top 7 and then continue doing that through the entire generation. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. We're not going to be using this. We're just going to be focusing on these custom generation parameters. But in the future, I will post a video going into all the mathematics of all of this. So back to the parameters we're actually going to mess with. Temperature. Temperature is a parameter for how greedy the model is. And in these LLM, not just LLM, Stable Diffusion has it too. Greedy refers to picking the highest probability. The greedier a model is, the more it's going to only pick the next token with the highest probability. So you keep the temperature at 0, it's going to be greedy, very greedy. And the output is going to only pick the highest probability. There's going to be very little variation, and you'll probably get extremely similar outputs per generation. Next, we have repetition penalty. This is just going to control the model's tendency to not repeat predictions or to repeat predictions. It's basically going to give a penalty for tokens that have already been generated. Setting it to 1 effectively disables it, and we can increase the penalty by sliding the bar. It's basically, you can think of it as a multiplication, so 1 changes nothing, and the more we increase this, the higher the penalty will be. And we have top K. Top K is going to change the number of tokens to be considered in the generation of the next token. So the lower the top K, the less tokens will even be considered. And we have top P. What top P does is it is a percentage. So it is going to pick the smallest set of tokens that exceed this percentage. And the smallest set of tokens whose cumulative sum of probabilities exceed this percentage. So the lower the percentage, the less tokens most likely will be considered, and you can use this in conjunction with top K to fine-tune the amount of tokens that get considered for the next generation. So if you set the top K to maybe 25, it's only going to, first of all, it's going to start by only looking at the top 25 tokens. Then if you set the top P to 0.4, of those 25 tokens, it's going to pick the smallest set of those 25 that have a cumulative probability that exceed 0.4. Okay, so with that basic background out of the way, let's take a look at where we are here. The original parameters I had, setting this to 1, this to 200, and this to 0, and this to 1. That should effectively disable everything and give us a greedy search that looks at the top 200 token. The prompt was a puzzle, and the response, I think, was pretty good. Maybe one of the best responses I've seen without doing any sort of prompt engineering. Okay, so after setting everything to basically neutral, you then want to take a look at the response you got and see what you like and what you don't like. I wanted to solve this logic puzzle, and it seemed to think that this was a joke instead. And it also generated a bunch of other jokes that are kind of in the same format, but all more focused on humor than logic, which isn't exactly what I wanted. So if I probably want to keep the max need tokens at 200 for right now, just to see what other generations it comes up with, to see if we're going in the right direction. But I think next I might want to not even worry about the generation parameters, but fix the prompt. So instead of common sense question and answers, I may type in solve this logic puzzle, or let's start with that, solve this logic puzzle, and see what it comes up with. Okay, so we can solve this logic puzzle as the input, and we'll see that it tried to solve the puzzle. It gave the basic answer that most people without further consideration may give. This is the first answer that GPT-3 gave, but GPT-4, I believe, did get it right on the first try, and I am paying, unfortunately, $25 a month or whatever it is. So yeah, GPT-4 did get it right on the first try, but GPT-4 has gotten quite a few of these logic puzzles wrong, and it does struggle to actually work through problems. So I think it has a larger data set, so it's trained on more puzzles probably. I'm not very impressed with GPT-4. I'll do another video on that. But we can also see that it added these comments here to kind of give me the impression that it is now considering logic puzzles, and it's pulling from its code base perhaps on GitHub. But we can also see there's a ton of repetition, which we don't like, but we might not have to worry about because we really only want this single answer. Okay, so we got the single answer we're looking for. Well, not what we're looking for, but we got a single answer, which is what we wanted, without it generating other answers. Instead, it generated a bunch of comments that seem to repeat themselves. So what we want to do next, most likely, is give some examples of logic puzzles to try and get it in the right direction. I doubt we'll be able to get this to answer correctly, but we may be able to get it to answer a separate logic problem correctly if we give it a bunch of examples of logic puzzles. So looking at GPT-3, this is actually ChatGPT, which is really GPT 3.5, not important. I did give it the correct answer and asked it to explain why, and it was able to explain why correctly. So what we can try before doing any additional prompting is throw in a hint. Maybe that will help. And if that doesn't help, we may want to tell it to explain the logic puzzle and give it the correct answer. But first, let's try and give it a hint. So I gave the very straightforward hint. The correct answer is not 5, and it came back with there are 4 ducks. No explanation. I don't know how it came to that answer, and I would like to know how it came to that answer. So I think I'm going to change the prompt to say solve this logic puzzle and provide an explanation of your answer. Now, this is a little bit complicated, so here is where you might benefit from providing some examples to show what I mean, but first to show what you mean, and maybe provide a couple logic puzzles with a couple responses, and then put in an explanation underneath so it kind of knows the format you're looking for. But let's just see what happens as is. Okay, so it actually picked up on the format that I wanted very well, and it gave a very nice response. Without changing any of these parameters, I'm getting responses that are much better than I'm used to, at least with the CPP version of this in Alpaca. But we're still getting the same block here with a ton of repetition that we don't like, but we will leave because I do want it to have room to generate more things if it so pleases. The explanation, although I like the format and the quality of the output is very good, the answer isn't really right and it didn't really explain anything. But I do like this. The question is a bit tricky because this is a bit of a tricky question. Quite frankly, just looking at it, I got it wrong. Well, so just looking at it initially, my first thought was wrong, but then I wrote it down and I did end up getting it right. Not to flex or anything, but I think a lot of people would get this wrong even after getting out a pen and paper and double checking their answer. Okay, so I tried to prompt it a little better with an even more hinty hint, and it still got the answer wrong. And the explanation was the classic initial thought that most people would have, where the duck in the middle is surrounded by two ducks in front and two ducks behind. And I think that that could be the right answer, but with this question, I think you're supposed to assume that there is a maximum of two ducks in front of a duck and a maximum of two ducks behind a duck and one duck in the middle. So 5 isn't the right answer. And even though it gave a good explanation, it's still stuck with 4 ducks, I guess because I told it the correct answer is not 5. So this video is not about exposing the logical flaws in these models, and it's not just Llama. GPT has the same issues. Alpaca which is just Llama, also has the same issues. They're not capable of actually working through problems. That's not how these models work, and I think this is a good thing to test to confirm to yourself that these things are not conscious. But let's go ahead and give it the answer and just ask it to explain, and then we'll move on to other methods of prompting for other kinds of questions. This is also to show that changing these generation parameters is really a final step. The first thing you want to do is ensure that your prompt is good, and I think the best way to do that is to set the max tokens a little bit higher than what you're looking for, to give it room to see where the model is headed. We see that it's giving a lot of comments, so that kind of comforts me into thinking that it is assuming that this is some kind of problem, perhaps some kind of coding problem, and coding problems are basically logic problems without any of the fun. No, that's not true. Without, just logic problems focused more on solving real world issues. So let's give it the answer and see if we can move forward from there. Okay, and another example for why I really like Llama. Although the outputs aren't that great, I really like how creative it is. So I got the answer wrong again, but it didn't provide an explanation in the way that I wanted it to. It gave some comments and it said, "This is a logic puzzle, not a math puzzle." And the comment is, "I'm not sure I agree. It's a logic puzzle that can be solved with math." And that's true. I think it gave it in a comment format like this was a forum. The repetition, obviously, I didn't put any penalties, so it's going to repeat itself a bunch, as this being the most likely for some reason. A very weird name. I like how with Llama, the basic outputs are very strange. But here's a time when you want to start adding examples. And I'm going to switch over to word analogies for adding examples, but that is step 2. Before even changing any of the parameters, let's start adding examples to get the model to give the format that we want. Okay, so step 1 was to edit the prompt until you're confident the model understands the prompt. Initially, you want to keep settings to replicate a greedy search, or I would say keep them neutral. Turn everything off and increase the top K to be the maximum value available. Then you want to, again, ensure that the model understands the prompt. So these models are generally pretty good at picking up on what you would like to happen. So you don't necessarily need to include a prompting theme, and I call the prompting theme just the initial instructions that you put at the top, maybe solve this word analogy. And that just kind of helps it get into the mood of doing what you want it to do, but it's not always necessary. Here, without adding anything, no context, and just providing a question and answer format, we were able to get it to provide questions and answers as well as generate an entirely new word analogy. Of course, it didn't create a word analogy in the format we wanted. It was more of a definition, and the word frugal means thrifty, which I think is correct and a pretty good attempt. It got this word analogy wrong, and the explanation shows that it doesn't quite understand how word analogies work. So seeing that and knowing that I would rather have the explanation be part of the answer instead of having an answer with a sort of explanation and then another additional explanation, we're going to provide examples, which is step 2. I'm also going to include a prompt theme as the initial sentence, and we'll see if it can do a better job and give a format that's easier to read. I'd also like some spaces in between the questions. Okay, so we've got 3 examples here with the prompt theme being to review these word analogies and solve the unanswered analogy. Each example has a slightly different format, and the final example is just is the question I wanted to answer. I have spaces here. It matches the format. It answers the question incorrectly. And not only does it answer incorrectly, it picks the wrong letter and then uses D as the value that it picked, even though it actually picked B. And then it created another word analogy that it repeated 3 times with the correct answer, in my opinion. I think sad is to depressed as happy is to elated, overexcited, angry, and upset. I think perhaps it could be excited, but I think elated is closer to happy, ecstatically happy. So I could see it being excited, but I think happy is better. So I think now is the time that we may want to start changing these custom generation parameters. I don't think that doing either of these will lead to the answer being correct, but it is possible. So since the format is how I like it, it does seem to pick up on answering the question. Even though it's giving the wrong answers, it does seem to answer the question and provide a small explanation in the answers section. And it is generating some new prompts, which I didn't ask it to do. But when it is generating them, it seems like it seems like the analogy that it did generate does come back with the correct answer. So that tells me that it does seem to have some understanding of how to correctly do these. I'm happy with everything except for the choices of words. And to affect the choices of words, we are going to want to change the custom generation parameters. Okay, so I increased the repetition penalty to try and get rid of some of those repetitions at the end. And I don't think this would be the best first choice, but I just wanted to see how it would handle that. The response we got was pretty good. It didn't pick any of the choices though. So I think we're going to want to go back to the prompt and change these different prompts to all be the same format to try and emphasize that we want to select from the choices that are available. But it did pick up on the fact that the word analogy is a relationship between words very well. Let's go back to changing the prompt. Okay, so here we go. We changed the prompt to make sure that every answer has somewhat of the format that we're looking for, and it came back with the right answer. Unfortunately, the explanation loses its credibility because it doesn't answer it in a way that shows that it understands how word analogies work. So perhaps we need more examples. I do think we can keep these parameters as they are because everything is exactly how we want it. It isn't repeating anything, it isn't generating new answers, it just wasn't explaining things exactly how we would like it to. Okay, so twice I had it generate an answer. When I removed the new example that I gave, it got it right both times, but adding the example I gave, it got it wrong both times. So there's actually 4 times I tried this, but that tells me, and I did add the example such that the blank was in the beginning, because it did seem to be focusing too much on the beginning first, and I thought maybe that would help, but it didn't. So since I'm seeing the same answers both times, I think next I'm going to, let's try to increase the temperature to about 1, and we'll leave everything the same. We want to try and change as little per generation as possible so we can know what has had an effect and what hasn't. So first we'll change the temperature, then I'll probably go back to the prompt and add another example if that isn't what I would want, and then we'll probably start messing with the top K, top P. Well, terrible. So after increasing the temperature, it just gave back the word meing, which as far as I know is not a word, and it doesn't look like it is. So I'm going to increase the min length and give it another shot. All right, so increasing the min length is just going to have a minimum amount of tokens to be generated, and I set it to be 50. It got the answer right again and referenced the correct word, but the explanation is very nonsensical, which tells me that the temperature, the top K, and the top P need to be adjusted. So at the temperature at 1, it's going to randomly select 1 out of the 200 top K choices. And I don't know the probability of these tokens, but they may be fairly close to each other because of how many words there are in here and how many ways there can be to provide some kind of explanation for each of these 4 options. So I wouldn't be surprised if most of the tokens were very close to each other in probabilities. So next I'm going to reduce the top K to maybe about 50. Okay, so with the top K at about 50, it gave a more coherent answer, but it was incorrect, and it kind of lost its ability to follow how word analogies work. So it picked D because it is saying that uptight is very similar to particular and fussy. So that means to me that I would like to also decrease the top P, and what that's going to do is further limit the possible outcomes to be, of these 50 in the top K, I want to pick the top P, I want to pick the top choices that have the smallest set of tokens that have a probability higher than 0.35 perhaps, or let's just go 0.5. And voila, we have gotten the correct answer with a good explanation. So this question tests your ability to understand how certain words are used together. Great. A person who makes a big deal out of small things would be considered very particular or fussy. Therefore, someone who goes along with everything without complaint, meekly, could be best described as being subservient. I think that's a great explanation with the correct answer, and we didn't change too much. We kept the temperature around the middle, and we dropped the top K to be around, the bottom third, bottom fourth, and we dropped the top P a little bit. So the temperature is going to increase the randomness. The repetition penalty is going to limit how often the model repeats certain tokens. The top K is going to only consider the top K tokens in the set of tokens that are possible, and the top P is going to pick, of the tokens that are being considered, is going to pick the smallest set of tokens that have a probability higher than 0.5. So all of these kind of reduce the tokens that are being selected in a way to increase the amount of tokens with a high probability, but also add a little bit of randomness so that we get something that is more in line with what a human would respond with. So are we done? That means that you could just copy these parameters and always get the prompts that you want. No, definitely not. You want to follow the steps, which are, and you can see with the regeneration, we got a different answer that was incorrect. So these are not even the optimal parameters to generate the right answer for this particular word analogy. What we probably would want to do is add some more examples, and that is part of the steps. First, you want to edit the prompt until you're confident that the model is understanding how to do what you're asking it to do. Then you want to provide some examples and continue editing the prompt so that it has some context for what you want it to do. And then you want to start changing the parameters. And for each thing you're changing, you only want to go one step at a time. So every time you edit the prompt, you probably only want to add one sentence or maybe paragraph, depending on if it's an example. And by paragraph, I mean block of text, depending on if it's an example or if you're changing the theme of the prompt, maybe you only want to change one sentence at a time here, but for examples, you might be okay just adding an entire block of text. But you definitely don't want to paste in a file of 100 different examples, because it's going to be hard to tell what exactly made a difference and what didn't. And for the custom generation parameters, you really only want to change one parameter at a time. And going from there, you should be able to tune your model to give you the results that you are looking for.